Hello, I am Paulo from Mexico, and this is a podcast that my wife Elizabeth and I started during the COVID-19 pandemic. We are always in the pursuit of knowledge, wisdom, and truth. So today, I am thrilled to have Professor Jay Bhattacharya from Stanford University. He's a professor of medicine and health policy, holding degrees in medicine and economics. Hi, Jay. Thank you for accepting to have this dialogue. How are you?
I'm doing well, Paulo. It's an honor to speak with you.
Great. I can guarantee that most people in Mexico and Latin America do not know anything about you and the Great Barrington Declaration, for example, but not because you lack the credentials or expertise, but because you were censored. Even when you and your colleagues, such as Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta, had the highest credentials working in top universities in the world. So your story needs to be told because of the implications for our future as a global society. So I'm going to start by asking if you could introduce yourself. Can you tell us a bit about who is Jay Bhattacharya and what this stands for university? This is also because for having a proper grounding for everyone who watched this episode, especially in Latin America.
So I'm a professor in the medical school at Stanford University. It's one of the top medical schools in the United States. I've been a professor for 23 years now, I think, and I've been actually at Stanford for almost 40 years because I did my medical training and my economics training. I have an MD and a PhD in economics, which is a strange combination, but actually it turns out to be quite useful. Throughout my career, I've used that economics training to apply it to very important medical topics, including how best to deal with infectious disease pandemics and infectious disease threats. And so I found myself at the beginning of the pandemic in kind of a unique position in having training both in the social sciences and in medicine and biology.
Oh, that is amazing to hear because not many people that can be able to have that complementary views. And many people is highly specialized, but then that is many times a problem because they are so specialized in one thing that they forget about everything else. And so I love to hear about your story, and I would love to ask you if you can kind of guide us in what was to be in your shoes, what was to be like by looking through your eyes during this whole process of the pandemic. And let's go step by step. So first, I'd like to ask, how was your life as a professor and a researcher at Stanford University before COVID?
It was my life before COVID was wonderful, actually. I had students. I wrote papers in scientific journals, and some of the papers had some impact, but it was an impact within the scientific community. I'd never written an op-ed. I'd never participated in political discussions. I think I'd been on TV once, and my mom watched it. But I had a very nice life, and I respected my colleagues. I thought that I was well respected within the university. I think I was, anyways. I have a full tenure, which is a marker of success within academic medicine, meaning that Stanford couldn't fire me because I had controversial views, for instance. I was supposedly free to be able to say whatever I like based on my research. So it was wonderful before the pandemic.
Yes, and I know that many people choose to be in the academic and research sector because they don't want to be activists, they don't want to be warriors, they don't want to be involved in very complex issues. But then you were kind of guided and put into all this situation. So what started to change from your view? What were the key issues that put you in a position of having a different view on what was starting to happen during the pandemic?
Paulo, when I first heard about a lockdown, I absolutely I shuddered in horror. I'll tell you a little bit more about my own background. I am an immigrant to the United States. I was born in a poor country, in India. My mom grew up in a Calcutta slum. And when I was little, sometimes we'd go back and visit. So I understood what poverty looks like, real poverty. Even though I live in a rich country and I work at a fancy university, that's my background. And when I heard about the lockdown, in terms of my social science training, I realized that the lockdown was going to harm every single poor person on the face of the earth. So in March of 2020, one of my first reactions when I heard about the lockdown was that this is a disastrous mistake. that it's aimed at trying to protect people from one disease, but at the same time, it is going to lead to disruptions of the lives of billions of people who cannot afford those disruptions, and it's going to harm the health of those billions of people. And so that was my first thought, that I have to use my training in order to tell the world that these ideas are not scientifically justified. These ideas of how to manage the pandemic.
No, totally agree. And also, what happens here in Mexico and Latin America and most peoples around the world is that many leaders here tend to believe that the US knows best. And if you live in the US and you work in a university such as Stanford, people here say things like, okay, whatever the US does, then we should follow it. Because if they are doing that, I think they have the greatest experts available. They have all the knowledge. So we should follow whatever they say, which means lockdowns, social distancing, masking, and COVID-19 vaccines. But in general, what is the right approach? Could we know better at that time when everything started?
In March of 2020, there was one big question that I had open in my mind, scientifically. The question was, how many people had already been infected? The disease supposedly started in January 2020 in the United States, and based on that, people were estimating, including scientific bodies, were estimating that for every person infected, three out of 100 people would die. Infected. 3 out of 100 people infected would die. But that was based on a false reading of the data. And I knew that because I had some experience with working on previous pandemics, on researching previous pandemics, that for many diseases like COVID, there were many people that had been infected but had not shown up at the hospital because their disease was relatively mild. And so I ran a study in April of 2020 measuring how many people had been infected. And it turned out a very large number of people that nobody knew about had been already infected and recovered, because the disease spreads very, very easily. And what that meant is that the infection fatality rate, the rate at which people die if infected, was very low, 2 out of 1,000, not 3 out of 100. And furthermore, we knew that it was really older people that were at high risk of dying if they get infected. Younger people, especially children, almost no risk, very, very low risk compared to other risks in their lives. So it was really striking to me, that scientific finding. What that meant was that the lockdowns were a tremendous mistake. And I saw also the influence that you mentioned, Paulo, about what American experts had on the policies of poor countries. Tony Fauci in India, where I'm from, was very, very famous. And the problem, though, Paulo, is that it wasn't true that every expert agreed with him. There was a major debate going on among experts, and yet the public only saw one view. We must lock down. We must close schools. We must wear masks. We must do all these restrictions on people's lives, or else everybody's going to die. 3 out of 100 are going to die, or 4 out of 100 are going to die. All of that was false. There was not a scientific consensus, and so I decided in the summer of 2020 that I would start to speak very publicly.
Oh, that is amazing, because not many academics, not many researchers are able to take that decision. I once wrote to Professor John Ioannidis, and he actually responded to me. but I was always thinking like, come on, man, why don't you also speak up? But we all know that he prefers to be just in the researcher academic side. But yes, there were many studies available since the early beginning. I read your story actually, but again, you guys who are watching this episode did not know about this because it was not publicly available by mainstream media or by governments. So in this, talking about the lockdowns, for example, there was this time when you started to use the term the laptop class and how lockdowns hurt the everyday working citizen. What do you mean by this term?
Well, what I mean is that when the lockdowns were imposed, the question is, who actually could abide by a lockdown, who actually could actually live through a lockdown reasonably. Well, first, you would have to not lose your job, right? If the society locks down and you can't have a job anymore, you can't feed your family anymore, well, the lockdown is not good for you. The laptop class are the set of people who had jobs that could be replaced by virtual work, by Zoom or by Microsoft Teams or something. It was a set of people who would not materially suffer from a lockdown, psychologically suffer because of course you're isolated, but not materially suffer. And so, and in the United States, that consists of about 20 or 30% of the population. Broadly around the world, it consists of maybe 1% of the world's population. The vast number of people on the earth are harmed materially by a lockdown, especially an extended lockdown. They lose their jobs, they lose their ability to support their families, and they are put in a very difficult position where they may have to take, even if they're elderly and are older and at high risk of dying if they get COVID, they have to take risks. Whereas the laptop class is protected. They can stay home, they can stay safe. And to me, that seemed very, very unfair. The policy that public health suggested to the world, that imposed on the world, was a policy that was aimed at protecting a very, very elite group of people at the expense of the poor, at the expense of children, and at the expense of the working class.
No, totally, totally. And by the way, I belong to the laptop class. I am a certified AI engineer. But
as do I. As do I. I'm also laptop class, but I don't think it's fair for policy to favor me over the vast number of people of the world, especially the poorest people.
Totally, and that is common sense. You don't need to be an expert to know that that people that need to go on the public transport, to go to open their local store or their shop, and to do manual work, they will suffer. I mean that was common sense, right?
It seems so obvious, but I think many people, especially American academics, have almost no experience or knowledge of what it is like to live without the privileges that we have. And so they couldn't imagine that a policy that they thought was good for them, stay home, stay safe, lock down, could be bad for the vast majority of the people of the earth. But in fact, that was what was true, that the lockdowns harmed so many people completely outside the imagination of the expert class in the United States.
Oh, totally. And in some other topic related to this, Martin Kulldorff wrote once about some key principles of public health, and he published it in an article and on Twitter also, on X now. But can you talk a bit about what are those principles of public health that were kind of almost forgotten during this process?
I mean, Martin Kulldorff was a statistician and a epidemiologist at Harvard University, an expert in public health, very closely involved in American public health in many ways before the pandemic. And he is the soul of common sense and ethical behavior when it comes to public health. Those principles of public health are so simple that when I tell you them, Paolo, you'll say to me, well, how come you need a brilliant scientist like Martin Kulldorff to say them? Doesn't everybody just know them? But in fact, everybody didn't just know them. They acted as if they were not, that they've forgotten them. The principles were things like, you don't just manage a single disease. Public health is about all diseases. You don't privilege the suppression of one disease if it increases the damage from other diseases. Public health is for all people. You don't just simply think about one group of elite people. You think about everybody. Public health respects the rights of people, so that we don't run over your rights, because on the idea that if we run over your rights, we can protect other people. It respects the individual autonomy. Public health respects scientific debate. Public health doesn't say that, oh, there's one view and that you shouldn't contradict us because we are so smart and so scientific. Science requires, and public health requires, there to be discussion, open discussion and debate, respectfully done. Those are the kinds of ideas that Martin Kulldorff put forward in his principles of public health. And I think I thought that everybody in public health agreed with them that before the pandemic. It was a huge shock and surprise to me to learn that so many in public health disagreed with such common sense principles.
No, totally, totally. And by the way, being in this top university in the world, having the credentials and the expertise and the knowledge about what is going on, how was it for you being the one or one of the few ones daring to have different views about the pandemic in the academic and scientific community?
You know, we started by asking me where I teach and what I do. I teach at Stanford University. It's a university that I've been at for 40 years almost, and I love the place. I was deeply committed to the mission of the place, which is research and education. And that sometimes means research that is in conflict with some other researchers. And before the pandemic, many of those research fights were resolved amicably. We would have a forum where I could say what I believe and what the other person could say what they believe, and we could have a discussion, and we could decide on experiments to do or whatnot to try to figure out who's right and who's wrong. During the pandemic, for the people, a few of researchers at Stanford, including John Ioannidis, who spoke up and said, look, these ideas of managing the pandemic, the lockdowns, the restrictions, the school closures are wrong and harmful. Those of us who spoke up faced a very hostile work environment. There were recriminations. There were physical threats. I faced two years of death threats in 2020 and 2021. The university did absolutely nothing to try to have a policy for an open policy forum where these kinds of scientific discussions could happen. It participated in the suppression of our views and marginalized us and made the lives of those of us scientists that were speaking up against the lockdowns a living hell. It made it a hostile. Created a hostile work environment that made it very difficult for me to do my job.
Totally, and again, sometimes life puts us in a situation that we don't want to become warriors, but there is no other way. So I remember in the first days of the pandemic when I started following you on Twitter, when it was still Twitter, that when and there is a nice guy being an academic, and I kind of see the process of how you were kind of turning into this warrior that say, "Come on, guys, this is this way." But you've been evolving as such as a professional, as a person, right?
Absolutely, Paolo. I mean, I think when I first, I'll tell you, as a confession, I used to tell graduate students and assistant professors, I would tell them, don't join Twitter. And before the pandemic, I'd say, because I thought. Part of me still wants to believe that the most important way as scientists can change the world is by doing good science. And so all you have to do is do good science, publish it, and the world will notice it because it's good science. It'll change the world. So don't waste your time on Twitter. I used to tell my graduate students, just do good science, communicate the science. And what I learned during the pandemic is I still believe that good science it really matters. I think it's very, very important that we do good science. I do think it can change the world, but I do also think that it doesn't automatically come to the attention of the public. And a lot of people manipulate the science that's out there so that and use it in ways to oppress people. And so I think that if I could say like why I've changed, how I've changed, is I think I've learned that it's not enough simply to say here's good science and do good science. You have to, I think ethical scientists have to get involved in the public debate about how the science is used, how it's interpreted. And you're absolutely right, Paolo. The first days I joined Twitter, I was very nervous actually, because I said, okay, everyone's going to see, every single thought I have. And so I was very cautious. I would post links to scientific papers that say a few things. But then over time, I realized that there was a hunger for people who wanted to understand, what did these scientific results mean? What did I really think about what should happen? And so I've become, as you call me, a warrior. I still don't think of myself that way, but I do have been much more vocal about that, and I'm very happy about it. Actually, I think it's linked me to a much broader community of people outside of scientists, and it's made my scientific work better because I can understand what impacts these scientific ideas have on actual real people.
Oh, totally, totally. And by the way, I remember also when you started to use some other terms, some concepts. One it was related to the science trademark and the expert trademark. How did that come, and how was the process of saying, okay, some people are not considering me the expert, so I need to tag them as the experts. I am not an expert; those are the experts. And there is one science. It is not just science, a process of discovering truth and wisdom. No, the science. So how did that happen?
I mean, I have to say, I thought I used to have this naive faith almost in the scientific process working itself out over time slowly. Sometimes, I mean, I thought about science, I guess, differently than many of my colleagues before the pandemic. I thought that science was the process of learning about the material world through systematic investigation, through hypotheses, and then testing, and then refinement of hypotheses, sometimes rejecting hypotheses that are contradicted by evidence. And it's a long conversation going back 100,000 years, ever since the beginning of the human race, maybe, where we slowly teach and learn about how the material world works. You know, that the and it's a as you said, Paolo, it's a process, and it's exhilarating, right? You have an idea about the way the world works. You do an experiment, and you see if the idea can work or not, and you're honest. When the experiment contradicts the idea, you change your idea, right? And you learn from other people, because none of us are smart enough to really know all of this. We have to learn from other people. It's a wonderful, wonderful process, and this is why I joined the field I did. Why I am a scientist. The absolute contradiction to that is the idea that you have one single person, Tony Fauci, who can stand up and say without irony that if you contradict him, you're not simply contradicting a man, you are contradicting science itself. Everyone knows that he represents science. So therefore, if you contradict him, therefore you must not be science. That is the antithesis of what actual science is. And so one of the things I've learned about on Twitter is that, I like to tell jokes with my friends. It turns out that you can also use humor on Twitter to do important things. And so the idea of the science came from this saying that everybody kept embracing early in the pandemic. They'd say, "Oh, let's follow the science." Well, what do they mean, follow the science? It's not a faith. It's a process, right? It's not like a religious worship. It is a humbling process of slowly learning about the material world. Um, with self-correction. So I thought it would be fun to make fun of this idea of follow the science. So I capitalized T for the and capitalized S for science. Maybe in Spanish it would be la ciencia or something. I'm not sure.
Exactly.
Capital L and capital S. That now science is not this humble thing that slowly produces knowledge about the world. Science is this dogma that is used to suppress your well-being, to suppress your freedom, to force you to accept a set of thoughts that don't correspond to what the experiments say, that don't correspond to your common sense, that don't correspond to the actual scientific data. And so I figured that would be a good contrast. The science, capital D, capital S, trademark, versus actual science, science that slowly builds on our knowledge system, that is consistent with our human values, instead of this authoritarian, dogmatic process that takes on the suit of science but doesn't actually do science.
Yes, science don't declare commandments, right?
Exactly.
No, and for everyone watching this episode, you have heard this from an actual professor of medicine and public policy at Stanford. Because when people like me used to say things like that, obviously, we were kind of attacked by some comments like, you're not a doctor, you're not a scientist, and things like that. But okay, going to another topic. What was your main driver in creating the Great Barrington Declaration, and what is it all about?
Paolo, before I go on to that, can I just say one thing about something else you just said right there?
Yes, 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 sorry.
Science can come from anybody. There is
Yes,
not, you do not need credentials to participate in the great river of conversation that is science. Great ideas can come from anywhere. It's not who they come from, it's do they match the data?
exactly.
Are the experiments that people do they contradict? So you can have brilliant scientists latch on to things that are deeply wrong simply because the data don't agree with it. And you can have humble people have ideas that appear wrong, but then the data back them up. That is the history of science. It's not credentials. It's ideas tested against data. That is what matters in science, and nothing else does.
Totally. And again, you're hearing this from Dr. Jay Bhattacharya. Let's talk about the Great Barrington
Okay, yeah. So
Declaration.
the Great Barrington Declaration. So the Great Barrington Declaration in October of 2020. Uh, if you put yourself back then in time, then we'd already been through the spring of 2020. There was a lockdown. There was a hope, I think, that was very clear from the epidemiological data that wasn't true. That somehow the spring lockdowns had gotten rid of COVID. The disease had just gone away. It was very clear to me in summer of 2020 that wasn't the case. That COVID was a disease that was here to stay forever. And in fall of 2020, I started getting very worried that the lockdowns that we'd imposed in March of 2020, some of which had been lifted in summer, would come back. That we would again embrace this crazy policy that had failed in the spring of 2020 to stop COVID, that had done tremendous harm to the poor of the world, that we would again do the same thing. Uh, my colleague that we've talked about, Martin Kulldorff, called me and said he wanted to hold a little conference. And he'd invited one of my heroes, Professor Sunetra Gupta. She is an incredible professor of epidemiology at Oxford University, another famous university in England. And he invited her to come, and he wanted the three of us to meet together to talk about how to manage the pandemic, maybe talk to some reporters. We flew to Great Barrington, Massachusetts, state in the northeast of the United States, and we met for a day, and we realized that we all three agreed on what the right way to manage the pandemic was, and it was based on two scientific facts that everybody agreed on. One is that the harm from COVID infection is so much worse for older people than for young people. Very deadly disease for older people, maybe 3, 4, 5% mortality for people over 80, where it was a very, very mild, very, very unlikely to produce mortality for young people. In fact, the flu for children is more deadly than COVID. That's one scientific fact. The other scientific fact is that lockdowns are deadly. Lockdowns kill, right? There were reports by the UN that there were 100 million people, 130 million people that were at risk of starvation caused by the economic dislocation by the lockdowns in April of 2020. The World Bank had estimated that 100 million people will be thrown into dire poverty, $2 a day or less of income. And it was very clear the lockdowns had done tremendous harm to the poor of the world. The school closures had destroyed the futures of countless children. Many of the children after the school closures never came back to school around the world. In Uganda, for instance, 4.5 million children after 2 years of school closures never came back. We destroyed the futures of tremendous numbers of kids on the idea that it was necessary to protect adults from the virus, but that was just not true. There was no scientific evidence for that. So we said in the Great Barrington Declaration, we decided we wanted to write it so the entire public could read and see and hear. We wrote it in very simple language. We said two things. One, protect older people better. Don't rely on the idea that you can have lockdowns to protect older people. Give them particular policies, that will enable them to be protected while the disease is spreading. So, for instance, give home delivery of groceries to older people, or organize, provide hotel rooms so that if older people are living with young people and the young person is exposed to the disease when the disease is spreading, provide hotel rooms that older people can stay. Really, it was an invitation, the Great Barrington Declaration, an invitation to public health people all around the world to participate in a conversation about how best to protect vulnerable people. Right? That's what we were expecting, because it's how you protect vulnerable older people will be very different in Mexico City than it will be in San Francisco, California, and you need local public health people with much better knowledge than I have to engage creatively with that. So that was one. Protect older people better. And then the second was to lift the lockdowns. Do not have the lockdowns ever again, because they were so damaging to the poor of the world and did not protect people against COVID. That was it. That's the Great Barrington Declaration. Those two things.
It is common sense, right?
I mean, that's what I thought. I have to say, I published many papers in my lives in scientific journals, and I'm very proud of many of them. Some of them are very complicated. But for me, this is the most thing I'm most proud of. And it was also the least original thing I ever wrote, Paolo. It was the way that we managed pandemics before this pandemic. It was
and the most and the most interesting thing for me, being an observer, being in another country, being in Mexico, part of Latin America, it is that mainstream media didn't tell us anything about this. I mean, professors from Stanford, from Harvard, from Oxford, tens of thousands of physicians around the world supporting this, and the world didn't know publicly about this. This is huge, I think. And how did you know? How did you know that you were systematically censored by media, by social media, and by your own government? How did that happen? How did you realize about this?
I mean, it was a shock to me. First, we wrote it, and we didn't expect everybody to notice it, but we put it on the web, and almost a million people signed it. As you said, tens of thousands of doctors, tens of scientists signed it almost immediately. And that was really heartening, because what we wanted to do is tell the world that there wasn't a scientific consensus in favor of lockdowns. That was a lie. There was tremendous numbers of doctors and scientists that disagreed with the lockdown policy. So I thought we did a good job with that. But then all of a sudden, just a few days after we wrote it, and it started to go viral, I started getting emails from friends of mine saying, "Oh, I live in," or people like just sometimes strangers. People, I live in France, and I did Google search on the Great Barrington Declaration, and I can't find it on the front page. I live in Kenya, and I can't find it. I live in Sri Lanka. I can't find it with Google. It turned out that Google suppressed it. It reduced the reach of it. There was a story that was published in Spiked Online. This happened almost immediately, within days of the Great Barrington Declaration coming out. Especially in countries outside the U.S., it suppressed it. Facebook took down the Great Barrington Declaration page we put up with no explanation for a week. They didn't tell us how we violated their policies. They just took it down. Twitter, if there were people on Twitter, there were doctors on Twitter who shared the Great Barrington Declaration. And in Canada, for instance, there's a doctor named Kulvinder Kaur-Gill. She put a link to the Great Barrington Declaration, and then her specialty society decided to do an investigation on her for the crime of sharing the Great Barrington Declaration. People started telling me that because they signed it, they lost their jobs at universities, that they lost opportunities to participate in grants. And it was really amazing to see. And then later on, a year later, I'm a participant in a lawsuit against the Biden administration called the Missouri versus Biden case, where the allegation we made is that the Biden administration was suppressing social media sharing of scientific ideas, and we found evidence that the government itself told social media companies who and what to censor. They in the Twitter files, when Elon Musk bought Twitter and he opened up the files so that anyone could see what they were, I found on my own Twitter database a picture of me, and it said the word blacklist on it under my face. The government itself told social media who to censor and what to censor, and they use that power illegitimately in order to suppress the spread of the idea of the Great Barrington Declaration.
Oh, this is huge. This is huge. I mean, again, for us, most people here just they say, okay, if the US is doing this, we should follow. But they don't know. Most don't know what was actually happening. So that is the importance of talking about these topics. And how it is the actual process? How is this legal process going?
So actually, it's going pretty well. I'm very hopeful actually. So the Missouri versus Biden legal case was filed by the Missouri and Louisiana Attorney General's office in the United States. So these are major states in the United States, and their governments are filing the suit against the Biden administration. And they asked me if I would participate as a plaintiff in the case because I think I have been censored by the government.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, Pablo. Yeah. So and what's happened thus far is that a lower court judge, in the federal judge, found that the government violated the American free speech rights. That they use their power to go to social media companies and tell them who and what to censor, and that violates the American First Amendment. It's like the judge actually wrote, this is like George Orwell's Ministry of Truth in 1984. And now we have the case now is sitting in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will hear the case on March 18th of this year. And I'm very hopeful that they will agree with the lower court judges that what the Biden administration did was illegal, that they violated a basic civil rights of people by suppressing scientific debate, using their power over social media to suppress scientific debate, when it would have been better for all people of the whole world to hear the scientific debate in all its honesty.
No, totally, and we need for that to go well, and democracies around the world need for that to go well because the implications are huge, are really, really huge. And also, now going through another part of all this story, thanks to all this progress of you becoming, I'm going to say again, a warrior, an academic warrior. I'm going to say that. But now you are appearing finally in many media outlets, giving testimony in Congress, participating in events with some politicians, and so on. Not because of their or political affiliation, but because there are some people actually pursuing truth and pursuing facts. Just because of that, but there is still much work to do, isn't it?
Oh, there's tremendous work to do. I mean, I think actually one thing that you said is important so that people understand. Sometimes people talk about the Great Barrington Declaration as if it were a right-wing document. That is not true. It's a common sense document that has to do with public health, not with left or right. Right. So, for instance, probably the government in the world that's closest to the Great Barrington Declaration policy during the pandemic was the Swedish government. The Swedish government has better outcomes for COVID and for all-cause deaths than the rest of Europe. But it was a left-wing Swedish government that used that policy. In the United States, you had the Florida government that was trying to do something closer to that policy. And of course, it was led by a right-wing leader. Leaders on the left and right embrace this policy.
Yes, but it is true that political polarization and political affiliation were a huge problem for having a specific view during all this process. Because if your political candidate or preferred politician follows certain strategy, then you say, okay, I'm going to follow that. And the opposition, I'm not going to follow that. And those people are evil and things related to that.
People turn their minds off. Instead of trying to look at the issue as an issue and think of it scientifically, they have a tribal affiliation. Oh, people I don't like this idea, therefore the idea is bad. That's just a big mistake, right? What I think is right, is healthy for society, is for everybody, no matter who you are, no matter what political leanings you have, to look at ideas and treat them fairly, treat them scientifically. So I think, I mean, you asked what we should do next. I think that the risk is that when there's another pandemic, we will lock down again. The American medical establishment and the public health establishment has not admitted that they made tremendous mistakes. Have pretended as if the policies that they pushed on the world didn't have the harms that they did, that they actually worked. When the opposite is true. And so the plans for the next pandemic, rather than following the successful management of pandemics that we had for the previous century of respiratory pandemics, where they follow those ethical principles of public health that Martin Kulldorff wrote, that follow the Great Barrington Declaration, instead we will lock down again when there's another respiratory virus pandemic, and your kids won't be able to go to school. It's likely you will not keep your job. Your small businesses will close. Every single restriction that was put in place will likely get put in place again, and the logic will be we will lock down until we have a vaccine. So we will rush into production of vaccine that's inadequately tested. The way we manage this pandemic is now the standard for how we will manage respiratory virus pandemics going forward in time. And unless there is a political movement now to change that, that's now unfortunately, I have to say, how the world will use it, will react to respiratory virus threats.
Oh, yes, yes, totally, totally. And one of the problems we have with these amazing dialogues is it is that time flies. So let's go to another topic now, going into lessons learned. And there are many, many lessons learned for you as an academic, as a professor, as a researcher. But let's start first with education. What are your main lessons learned on education? And a straightforward question. Do education systems work?
Well, I think that before the pandemic, I thought, and I still believe, that education of our children is the most important investment a society can make. That it is vital that we understand that in our social policy, in our public health policy. I still believe that, and I think that that is a major lesson that should be taken from the pandemic. When we closed schools, we harmed the futures, not just the material futures, but the health futures of a tremendous number of our children. Social inequality, economic inequality will grow as a consequence of those school closures into the next generation. So I think that's one lesson I hope everybody has learned. We should never again take so lightly our investment in our children. At the same time, I think there's some problem with how we do science education or medical education or public health education. Basic facts, basic idea about how the scientific process works. Apparently, very large numbers of our most prominent scientists don't share these ideas that we thought about. And that points to a real deficiency in our elite education. The way we train the top scientists and top public health workers clearly is a problem, because they did not adhere to basic ideas and basic principles that everybody agreed on, but even basic ethics. So I think I guess there's twofold. We have to keep investing in our children. Never again, we should commit that never again should we stop investing in our children that we did during the pandemic. And then let's reform higher education so that we produce actual scientists and not ideologues.
Totally, totally agree. And another topic related with lessons learned on medicine and health. Because for me, I have my story on health, and I know that it is not the same to know about health than to know about medicine. What are your key lessons learned related to medicine and health?
Well, Paulo, I think I share that idea. That's an idea that I thought I shared before the pandemic. It's a lot. I do think medicine is important, of course. I'm not saying that it's. I'm not saying you shouldn't have medicine. Of course, if you have diseases that medicine is well equipped to treat, if you have a heart attack, for instance, it's vital. But most inputs into health have nothing to do with medicine. Most public health inputs into health have nothing to do with medicine. Good sanitation, good food, the ability to exercise, clean air, clean water, those are much more important than medicine as inputs into good health. And a lot of the kinds of ideas that that medicine has ignores things like recommendations for a healthy lifestyle,
Yes.
right? As if somehow somehow unscientific, but it's not unscientific. I think a well-functioning society, a healthy society, has medicine in its proper place, but it also has fantastic public health systems that guarantee clean water, clean access to clean food, and so on, and also recommends and gives good scientifically based advice about good lifestyles. That I think is what produces health. Societies that are well connected with each other. I mean, it's not just physical health, there's also psychological health. So societies that are well connected with each other, that provide opportunities for young and old to interact meaningfully with each other. Societies that produce, opportunities for dialogue with people we disagree with in respectful ways. Those are healthy societies, and it's not that none of that is about medicine.
Totally, totally agree. Another thing related to this, and we talked a bit about it, but what about the government? What lessons have you learned about the government?
Oh my goodness, Paula, what can I say about it? I think I mean I think that the government has an obligation, by dint of the great power that it has, to use that power ethically. And a lot of that obligation, I think I had hoped had been built into the structures of government itself. But what I found during the pandemic is that the government, when it decided that it was going to essentially remove the possibility of it being criticized via restrictions on speech, can act in deeply unethical ways because they're unchecked. So probably the most important thing I've learned about government is that probably the most important right that we have with the government is the right to speech. And that's the queen of all the rights, I think, because if you have that right, then the government will have much more difficulty trampling on our basic civil liberties. It'll be easier to correct it when it makes mistakes, and easier to point out abuses when they happen, so they can be addressed. So that's, I think, probably I always thought I was a free speech I mean, I wasn't a warrior before, Paulo, I have to say, but now I'm a warrior for free speech, and I'm really proud to be. I think that is the most important thing that any government can guarantee its citizens.
Totally, totally. And thank you for being this warrior. Just three little things, but very important also to finish this dialogue. Being this such a complex and global issue, many people tend to look for the evil elite that is the responsible for all of this. But it is a complex global issue. Who will you say is responsible for all the terrible decisions made? Can we point out to a specific evil individual or group of individuals for all of this mess?
No. Unfortunately, the answer is no to that question. I don't think there's a single individual you can point to. I think the pandemic. I believe the pandemic happened because of a lab accident, and the reason why that lab accident happened is that people thought that these lab experiments would be necessary to improve the health, would protect people against the pandemic. So there's an
Yes.
irony there. The public health establishment panicked in response to this because they thought it was such a unique threat that throwing out their entire playbook of ethical public health policy was necessary. And so I think at the beginning of the pandemic, you had many people acting as well as in well-intentioned ways, but they were scared. Then what happened is that many other people worked very hard to take advantage of it. Pharmaceutical companies, testing companies, government politicians, even scientists who wanted to climb the scientific ladder. So it's a very complicated thing. I think the origin of the pandemic and the early management of it was panic, which is completely understandable, although not really excusable in a sense. And then corporations took advantage of it for their own benefit. Some of them thinking that they were doing good for the public, others just simply in a venal way. And so that's, I think, what you have. It's not one single individual. As tempted as I am to say Tony Fauci is the central villain, that's actually not true.
Totally agree, totally agree. And also, once I asked you a question related to the following on Twitter, and I love to have the answer here. Would you mind sharing this answer? The question is, are you still happy working at Stanford and living in California? Because they don't seem to be like the best places to be during these times.
My wife wanted to move out of California through the whole pandemic, actually, because our kids they suffered a little in schools because the schools were closed. I have to say it's my home, Paulo. I think, and I have an obligation to try to heal it when it's broken. And so for me, because I've been here for so long, it's hard to imagine leaving. It's like leaving your family or leaving the place you love. Just because you love a place doesn't mean it's all good. And our job, I think, as individuals, when we're rooted somewhere, is to do the best we can to try to improve that place, even especially when it goes wrong. So that's what I'm trying. That's why I have not left.
Oh, that is an amazing answer, and I hope many people there hear about it here. And lastly, are you optimistic about the future? Please share with us some wisdom, because you've been in the front line during this battle that seems to be still going.
Paulo, I'm very optimistic. The number of people around the world who understand that what we did was deeply wrong is tremendous. It's just now just a few elite, powerful people who control narratives but it's very, very brittle. Their control on power. Most people understand what happened was a tremendous mistake, even if they're not scientists and they didn't follow the debate. They know what we did was wrong, very, very wrong. The people are with us, Paulo, and I'm very optimistic when that is the case, that good things will happen.
Oh, that's amazing. I'm also very, very optimistic. Elizabeth, my wife, it is also very optimistic. And please get along with all these optimistic people because we need more of you. Thank you. It's been an amazing dialogue, Jay.
Thank you, Paulo. So it's such an honor to talk with you.